for showing up for a topic here that isn't always the most comfortable thing to talk about. It certainly isn't the most sexy thing to talk about, but I'm going to do my best this afternoon to keep us all engaged at as much as possible. So I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that in order for me to kind of go over the finer points, the nuances of the access laws, it would take me 3 to 4 hours to explain it in detail, and I'm not going to do that. The bad news is I think I'm going to bore you with the rest of Karen's time as well as mine to go over maybe some things that I hadn't planned on talking about, but I think would be relevant to your all's practice and certainly relevant to what you do on a day-to-day basis. The way I like to do presentations, and I think a lot of you I've spoken to previously, is that I like to have a dialogue as much as possible. So I don't have a script. I have a PowerPoint. You have the PowerPoint. We're not going to follow that verbatim. I want to make sure that we talk about this afternoon what you want to learn about. Or maybe you want to challenge me on if you've read some of my opinions and maybe have maybe a differing perspective. A lot of you I have worked with in the past, and I might even pick on a few of you this afternoon in a very gentle manner, just kind of illustrate some of the things and some of the challenges that I see on a day-to-day basis and that certainly would affect you as well. So I invite you for a conversation about the access laws. How can I help you? How can we do our jobs better? How can I learn from you? Because when I come and I do these seminars and I do these trainings, it's certainly important for me to have a takeaway as well. And if there is a corner that I haven't quite seen around yet that maybe you can shine a light on some things, boy, I'd love to hear that. One of the benefits of being able to travel and to do these kind of trainings is that at this point, 5 years into my tenure, I have been to every county in Indiana. And that's extremely helpful for me to see how you do things in Lake County versus how you do things in Franklin County, which are very different. But there's a lot of common threads that go through county government, and it certainly is helpful for me to see those kinds of things come together and inform how I can do my job better as well. I'm going to violate the first rule of public speaking right away and read off my initial slide, and I promise this is the only time I'm going to do this, but this is a good table setting slide to give you some perspective as to where I come from, how I approach things. This comes from what I call the preamble of the Access to Public Records Act. This is the legislature's intent in drafting the Access to Public Records Act. There's some bleed over to the Open Door Law as well, but I think it kind of colors the intent of all of the Indiana Code as it regards to in regard to access issues. It says that a fundamental philosophy of the American constitutional form of government is that the government is the servant of the people and not their master. Accordingly, it is the public policy of the state that all persons are entitled to full and complete information regarding the affairs of the government and the official acts of those who represent them as public officials and employees. Providing persons with the information is an essential function of a representative government and an integral part of the routine duties of public officials and employees whose duty it is to provide the information. And typically I leave off the last little paragraph of this, but because most, if not all of you are attorneys, I think it's important when it comes to interpreting statute that I illustrate the final portion, which says that the statute itself is to be liberally construed in favor of transparency. So when we're talking about the semantics of statutory interpretation, I'm not a strict constructionist when it comes to interpreting the Access to Public Records Act. There are gaps and loopholes in the statute itself, which if I was on the other side, I would certainly want to represent my client zealously and ethically and effectively, but also find out how can I help them do their jobs better, and maybe there's a loophole I can exploit or a gap that I can push through to make sure that my client can do or take a certain action. Well, my job is to kind of fill in those gaps and say, wait a minute, just because you can, does that mean you should? And so when I go about approaching a problem or a fact pattern and I go to write a legal opinion, that's what informs me, is this legislative intent of erring on the side of transparency. And everything that Karen talked about in the last hour, it kind of sets the table for our discussion this afternoon, in that transparency breeds accountability, which makes sure that the citizenry is informed as to that their public officials are taking action to their benefit, to the public's benefit, and not to their own benefit. And that accountability structure really takes root with the access laws. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of perspective. I'm going to talk for a minute about my office if you're not familiar with it. And then I have a couple of highlights as far as subject matter topics I want to talk about. I don't want to have this be a rote recitation of the law. The PowerPoint kind of does that. You can follow along in there. And certainly, if there's one note that I'd encourage you to take today, it would be how to get in contact with me. I've got it on the next slide. I think it's on the third page there with the website. It's just www.in.gov/PAC. One of the beauties of my office is that it's so small. Now, that can be a frustrating challenge for me, but for constituents and for attorneys and reporters and other public officials, that means that more often than not, when you call into the office, you're going to get me directly. You don't have to go through many layers of bureaucracy at all to get to the source. Now, I have one single staff member who is extremely competent and knows the law very well. He's in the process of taking the bar. He has his JD, so he knows these laws probably more than anyone in the state, save for a handful of a few of you guys, and he's very good. But sometimes there's a question that you might want to be more comfortable if you heard it from me directly, and I understand that as well, and I'd be glad to help you out with that. But we're a two-man office. And we cover the entire state, from other state agencies and our colleagues in the executive branch, but also the legislature, also the judicial branch. I receive complaints about judges and courts, and certainly on the local level, from counties to municipalities, all the way down to the township level. And so we see all kinds of different issues. We see all kinds of bureaucratic structures, and that helps us do our jobs better as well, to see how government bureaucracy works, how it breathes, how it moves, how it changes. I've been in this job for 5 years now, and I have seen substantial paradigm shifts in ways that you wouldn't believe sometimes. And not just turnover in administration, not just turnover from Republican to Democrats being in control of a certain council or board, but just in the way that attorneys approach the law, the way that I approach the law. My process has evolved. My legal analysis has evolved as my kind of voice at the table has matured a bit over the last 5 years. And so while consistency is definitely what I strive for, I also recognize that certain factors change, no more so than in terms of technology. 5 years ago, social media wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. So whereas public employees and public officials almost always will have a Twitter or a Facebook account, whether it's private, whether it's public facing, whether that invites a forum for the public to weigh in. That wasn't there as much in 2013 when I took office. So I've had to kind of think on my feet a little bit and adapt to the changing times, because the legislature can't always catch up. Now, it has in certain cases. I'll use the example of body cams for law enforcement. And if your county sheriff has adopted and opted into the body cam scheme, which I think is a very good thing, that comes with a whole set of challenges that were unheard of before the legislature passed some sweeping laws to address the subject just in 2016. And before that, it was kind of anybody's guess what the General Assembly would say in terms of this body cam footage. Well, now we know, but there's still some unknowns out there as that technology evolves, as the usage of that mechanism evolves as well. So it's not a boring job, even though the law itself is kind of dry. You know, when it comes to this stuff, again, it's not the sexiest of topics. But I see fact patterns that are very much relevant, that are very much interesting. I've always said that if it ever gets to the point where I'm bored in my job, or even worse, that I lose my voice of effectiveness when it comes to writing my opinion, then that's time for me to step down. And I still believe that. But I, as a policymaker, as an interpreter of the law, I certainly do feel like there's still work to be done in this field, and that I can still bring something to the table. So you're stuck with me for the time being, and for the foreseeable future, I hope. I think it's also important to highlight the fact that my office is apolitical, and on a personal level, so am I. When then Governor Pence chose me to be public access counselor, I had to go through an interview process. It wasn't a political patronage type thing. I wasn't involved in the Republican Party. I was not involved with his administration. It was truly kind of plucking me out of obscurity. And I think that his staff, when going about trying to appoint someone, had the foresight to see that they didn't want someone embedded in the political game, because then that might lend itself to favoritism one way or the other. And so when it comes to big P politics, I'm kind of an equal opportunity offender when it comes to when I write my opinions. And I think that's important to start a conversation with when it comes to someone like me who's considered an ombudsman and an interpreter of the law. Just a few odds and ends here. My office doesn't have any kind of enforcement authority. It's advisory only. I consider it to be educational in nature and interpretive. I take the counselor part of public access counselor very literally and very seriously. In the past, I think opinions from my office, from prior office holders, have tended to be a little bit technocratic, devoid of any kind of practical application or policy suggestions. I've, for better or for worse, flavored my opinions with some best practices and some good governance tips and advice, and certainly take those with a grain of salt. I'm not the authority on local governance, although I do consider myself to be a proponent of good governance when it comes to the things that the access laws touch. So if you read my opinions, I hope they don't come across as gotcha. I do not take any kind of satisfaction in browbeating my colleagues. I have to work with all of you. I have to work with your clients. I do not set out with the intention to offend, but sometimes I need to use language that is strong enough to indicate that I strongly recommend a course correction in something that a municipality or a county or a state agency or the governor's office has done. And I'm not shy about doing that. I've put some bold statements in there, and I think by and large those have been well received. But if I do that, if I go about using some strong language, I try my best, if possible, to predicate the publication of those opinions with a conversation with a representative from that municipality so that they know what's coming. I don't want to surprise anyone or catch anyone off guard. I really do consider this to be an educational position, and I'm here to make your jobs easier and be a tool in your tool belt or your client's tool belt to make them better at their jobs. So as far as what we do, other than this kind of stuff, and I do about 50 to 75 of these a year, I also do field complaints, and that's an adversarial process set up by statute. It's us versus them type thing, with me being in the middle as the mediator. A constituent or another public official or a reporter will file a complaint with my office alleging some sort of non-compliance on the part of the government unit. And so I take that complaint, and I always solicit a response from a public agency, just like a court would do. And then in that little area, in what I do, I kind of sit as a judge, although I don't consider myself a judge, even an administrative judge, at all, but it has that flavor to it. And then I make a decision whether the agency is in compliance with the access laws or when it's not. And typically I've said that about 40% of the time I find non-compliance, and I find that the complaint is justified and meritorious. And someone asked me just the other day what was my current statistic, and I had to go back and compile those again. And it turns out that over the past couple of years, that's only been about 25%. I can't take credit for that. Your clients can, though, in that they're following these laws better than they have before, which I think is a testament to their commitment to transparency. And I know more than most that there is more scrutiny than ever on public officials. I highlight this slide because that first number up there, 5,000, we received 5,000 inquiries or requests for assistance. It's probably the better way to put that. That number was about 1,500 when I took office. And this year that will jump to about 7,500. I'm compiling my annual report to the General Assembly this year. And so as those requests for assistance have exponentially grown, it's a testament to, again, your clients that the number of violations that I see has an inverse correlation, which is extremely satisfying and gratifying to me, although, again, I can't necessarily take credit for that. But as far as what we do on a day-to-day basis, this is it. We try to keep the actual opinions that we publish to a minimum, employing more of a quality over quantity standard. We weed out a lot of them. We mediate a lot of them. I think this year we're only on track to publish about 180, 190 opinions. A lot of that is because I've addressed a lot of these issues before, and I can just refer back to a prior opinion. But also we take more of an active role in mediating these disputes before they get to the point of an opinion. And we've been pretty successful at that. All those opinions are published at that website right there. And that, again, if you do take anything away, make note of that. Make sure that you know how to get a hold of me. A lot of you probably have my cell phone, which I'm generally available 24/7, or I try to make myself available as much as possible. And again, I'm not really interested this afternoon in going through the PowerPoint slide by slide. A couple things I planned on talking about today. Certainly give you a brief update of the 2018 legislative session, what the General Assembly did as far as the access laws. Yeah, Trammell.
Good afternoon. I wanted to get to this before we got too far down the road. You actually brought up something that I wanted to discuss today. of an ALJ to a mediator, if you will. So like in your opinions at the end, how you would find at the end of every opinion, so-and-so violated or so-and-so did not violate. So now it's kind of a discussion of how to work through the problem. You kind of talked about what informed your decision to move that way. But what would you suggest for somebody like me, I'm an attorney and a government official will come to you and say, was this right or wrong?
Yeah.
And I need to be able to try and sharpen my pencil against, violated versus didn't violate. What do you think about maybe getting a few more of those violated versus didn't violate things?
Yeah.
Or just how that affects attorneys in court?
Well, I think if there's a clear-cut violation, I'm going to say so. And so in the absence of that language, you can assume that it's just a matter of maybe shifting the way you go about doing things and using that opinion as guidance. There's nothing in the statute or case law that suggests that non-compliance versus compliance language is needed in an opinion, even for the purposes of taking it to trial court. The standing is preserved by a complainant just by merely filing the complaint. And they want the win-loss as well. They want to know. They don't want to leave it open-ended. But I find that now that I've kind of changed the way I structure an opinion, that it invites more dialogue. And it invites folks to reach out to me. Maybe it makes my office a little more approachable than it was before. Because I'm not an ALJ, because I'm not a judge, I'm not bound by ex parte communication type considerations. So I can have that, and I often do, with an attorney, even after a filing is made. I can talk to the complainant, I can talk to the respondent freely, and learn more, try to settle more using that approach and that tactic. Sometimes it's inevitable. It's going to wind up being a yes or no, black or white decision. But I'm trying to move away from that, just to be a kinder, gentler counselor. But that's an ongoing task to try to figure out how to best craft and structure an opinion to meet that goal, while still providing sound guidance and sometimes, if it's necessary, a winner and a loser, basically. Yeah, but that's a good question. So anyway, the things that I did want to talk about today, again, legislation, new legislation. I want to talk a little bit about executive session and administrative function, which is going to piggyback off of some of the new legislative session. If you don't know what an administrative function is, you'll hopefully know by the end. Want to talk about using devices during meetings, cell phones, laptops, things like that, communication amongst the board during meetings. Certainly talk about the issue of private emails versus emails that are on a public server. Want to talk about electronic records, which were mentioned in the legislation as well. Economic development issues and public access issues regarding those kind of non-government, nonprofit entities, which may take money in the form of appropriation, and when that might rise to the level of not only an audit by the State Board of Accounts, but also when it triggers access considerations. And talk about social media as well. That was kind of my informal, loose blueprint for the afternoon. But again, as we sit here talking and you guys come up with something that you want to talk about, I'm certainly welcome to address any other topic as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And what we'll do, I think, just for everyone's sake, is around 2:20 or so. Take a little bit of a 5-minute break things up a little bit. So maybe you can think about during the break, maybe some things we can talk about afterward. So just a quick rule of thumb to give you an idea of what the open door law says, and I will use this next slide, but as most of you know this already, but anytime a majority of a governing body takes official action on public business, there has to be 48 hours notice, and it must be open to the public. That's the hard and fast rule. It's also important to remember that a public meeting, which has to do with transparency and openness and accessibility by the public, is different than a public hearing. A public hearing has more to do with due process than access. So I really don't spend a lot of time in my job about public hearings. Hearings have a different kind of notice. They often different kinds of hearings have wildly different kinds of notice, actually. When it has to be published in the paper, and how long in advance, whether interested members of the public with a vested interest need to be notified independently, and things like that. We're not going to talk so much about that today. I'm not the subject matter expert on that, but this just has to do with meetings as a whole. The one exception I will cover is BZA hearings, or I'm sorry, PETA BOA hearings, because there's often confusion into how to appropriately conduct a PETA BOA hearing in context of all of this stuff. But anyway, this basic rule is what you're going to follow from the majority of your public meetings. You'll notice that it doesn't say anything about an agenda. You don't have to give the subject matter in advance. There are some exceptions. I'll talk about those in a minute. But as far as agendas go or subject matters go, if you're going to use an agenda, it has to be made available contemporaneous with the meeting. It doesn't have to be posted in advance. So it just has to be there for members of the public to pick up and follow along with the meeting. But there can be deviations from that meeting as well. So really that agenda isn't necessarily something that marries your boards and commissions to a particular course of action. My one caveat to that is that if you do post an agenda, don't pull a bait and switch by then addressing something highly controversial during that meeting and freezing the public out. I don't think that's appropriate either. And one more item as far as meetings go. Now, the open door law gives the public the right to observe and record the meeting. Does not give them the right to participate in a meeting. I advise a state board that for whatever reason that board's constituency took great exception with the way they were conducting their meetings and their business, and really they kind of missed the point in my opinion. But there was a non-discriminatory flat formula for appropriating funding across counties to what are called independent living centers across the state. They're just a pass-through for a federal grant. And some local independent living centers took exception with that formula. Some counties thought that they deserved more based on certain factors than others. And so what they did in protest is they literally came and protested the meeting during the meeting. So they showed up with signs, they showed up with air horns, they shouting and chanting, hell no, we won't go type stuff during the meeting. And before they kind of brought me in as a consultant, that board couldn't even get out the Pledge of Allegiance before having to shut the meeting down and reconvening for the next time. And so I came in and addressed, the members of the public who were there, and I said, no, guys, you can protest all you want, but not during the meeting and not here in this space. This is a space for observing the meeting, and you can record it, kind of inconspicuously. You can't participate unless invited to do so. And that's a good rule of thumb too. I think that there can be some structured parameters around a public comment forum. If you want to give, the first 5 people First come, first serve. They sign up on a sign-up sheet, whether it's in opposition or support of an initiative, to come forward, say their piece for 5 minutes. And so long as they stay on topic and they don't use profanity and they aren't abusive and they aren't disruptive, then I think that's a good outlet. Is anyone here from Hamilton County? If not, I'm sure you're familiar with the Islamic Life Center that they're planning on putting in Carmel. Well, when they went about doing that, I think they went about it in a very, very responsible way. They saw that there was going to be an outpouring of both support and opposition to that Islamic Life Center being placed in a rural part of that county. And so what they did was they knew that they could not accommodate everyone at their local town hall, their normal meeting space. So then they shifted it to what's called the Monon Center, which is kind of a community recreational center up in Carmel. And they allowed everyone that wanted to speak either 1 or 2 minutes to do so. And it was very orderly, and they accommodated everyone. Now, that Monon Center, it turned out because of fire code occupancy requirements, they couldn't get everyone in. And so they couldn't necessarily foresee that the attendance would exceed, I want to say like 400 at the time. But anyway, so they bifurcated that meeting and moved it to the Palladium, which is like a 1,200 seat theater up in Hamilton County, which allowed everybody else to come in, say their piece. And then the next time, and I think they split that one up into two as well. They allowed supporters one night to air their support, and then opposition an opportunity the next week or next month to air their grievances over the project. And I thought that was a wonderful way of recognizing that this was a very controversial, hot topic. And they went above and beyond. Now, I'm not suggesting that you do that for every single little initiative or ordinance that your local boards do, but if you have the foresight to kind of see around that corner and recognize that, okay, we can't accommodate everyone here. We know that this is going to solicit a lot of conversation. So let's set some parameters on how to do that in a way that allows that conversation but still restricts it respectfully, not discriminating on the message or the content of that conversation, but more so placing parameters on the order of how that content is presented. And so I have to give them a lot of credit for what they did in that instance. But that's just one illustration of how you can be creative in solving some of these problems. And I recognize that not every initiative is going to be that controversial, and you don't need to move venue every time something might come up. But in those big ticket items, maybe you want to look at something like that, or maybe you want to allow that comment during that or prior to that vote. Even if it's not something that you necessarily or your clients necessarily are going to want to hear. I recently wrote an opinion, which was kind of strongly worded, suggesting that, kind of going with this theme, that when it comes to accountability and transparency, it's not the most comfortable thing for a public official to receive that scrutiny and that criticism. We all want to hear that we're good at our jobs. No one likes to hear that we're performing in a way that someone takes exception to. And I understand that. But when we avail ourselves of public employment, even more so when we put ourselves on the ballot or put ourselves up for appointment, then we kind of have to develop a bit of thick skin. The way I like to analogize it, and I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but back in, I hated this, back in high school, when I took a geometry class, it was the first time that I ever had to show my work when it came to arriving at a conclusion. You take a test and you have to go through these elaborate, tedious proofs. And you kind of have to show the instructor how you arrived at the final answer. And I don't think that's so different than this public access stuff. We're kind of doing the same thing. We're kind of just showing our work. But I think that's a good opportunity. And what I've learned in the time since I was a sophomore in high school is that, the more thought you put into the decision-making process, the more thoughtfulness and mindfulness that you demonstrate when it comes to arriving at a conclusion, the better accepted it can be. Now, that's not a universal truth. Everyone is going to have their opinion on whether the answer was right or wrong in the end, but you may get some credit along the way for showing your work and for detailing how you arose at a conclusion. So I think in terms of public access, having these public meetings to make these decisions is kind of an opportunity for messaging. If I'm a board member, I want my constituents to know that, I'm not doing this on a whim, or I'm not doing this for my own benefit, but I've thought this through, and here's how I've done so, and then we'll vote. It's an opportunity for messaging. It's an opportunity for politicking a little bit, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if it's done in good faith. But that said, not everything is appropriate for a public meeting. And the legislature recognizes this in a couple ways. One that kind of applies to all boards and commissions, and another that applies exclusively to two types of bodies. Number one, a town board, which we won't talk about today, but the other is a county board of commissioners, and their unique status as a kind of a three-headed monster of the executive branch of county government. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I want to talk about the first one, which is executive sessions. That's the exception to this rule. The legislature and my office of certainly following suit has recognized that there are certain things that rise to a level of sensitivity that aren't necessarily appropriate for public dissemination. There are things just in the course of administrating a bureaucracy that you have to do behind closed doors and for good, solid reasons. Number one, say the county is sued. And at some point along the way, either the county council or the county board of commissioners has to meet with an attorney to discuss litigation strategy. And if that's done as a majority of that board or council, well, this stuff would normally apply. You'd have to do that in the open. But it doesn't make much sense to have that strategic discussion in an open meeting because, your opponent, your adversary, could be in the audience and be tipped off or clued in as to your strategy. So the General Assembly has carved out an exception for discussions of legal strategy with the county attorney, or if you're outsourcing that litigation, whoever that attorney might be. And so I think that's a really good reason to conduct that kind of business behind closed doors. And I don't think that compromises or erodes accountability or transparency in any way. It just makes good sense. And so I'm a proponent of using an executive session judiciously, but responsibly and as needed. Another case that's come up in the news a lot lately with my office is to discuss, personnel factors or considerations. Say you have an employee that's been accused of some kind of wrongdoing or malfeasance, and maybe those allegations have not been substantiated. So it would not be fair to that employee to have a public meeting to discuss those allegations. Maybe there is no substantiation whatsoever. Maybe it was just a disgruntled constituent or a disgruntled fellow employee that made those allegations, and they're meritless or baseless or even blown out of proportion. And so the law allows a board to go into an executive session behind closed doors to talk about those kinds of things. Again, it makes sense. It's common sense that a board be allowed to do that. But let's scale that back and talk about county boards of commissioners, exclusively. There's a mechanism in the law called an administrative function meeting. This brings us to our first piece of new legislation as well. So an administrative function meeting is parsed out in the law to allow a county board of commissioners to discuss the day-to-day operations of county government on a whim. It's not a closed-door meeting like an executive session, but it can be held without notice. And what the new legislation attempts to do is to clarify what an administrative function is and what it is not. And I still don't think there's a bright line, unfortunately, but it moves it closer to what that bright line could be. And I think it's a fact-based type deal, whether it's administrative or operational, or whether it's substantive policy. Substantive policy would be the discussion of a new ordinance or an amendment to an ordinance. It would be to the entering into a brand new contract, or discussions with a new vendor or an economic prospect. Those kinds of things are more appropriate for a public meeting, either a regularly scheduled meeting or a special meeting. Special meetings, by the way, if you're not familiar with those, are just irregularly scheduled meetings that aren't your monthly council or commissioners meetings. If you hold a special meeting for commissioners, then you do have to give subject matter for that special meetings, but it's still 48 hours in advance. It used to be 6 days, I want to say, before that was changed a few years back. But anyway, but the point of that administrative function meeting is to do the types of things that a mayor could do or a town manager could do without having to have authorization from the council or the board, recognizing that the county board of commissioners is the executive branch of county government, and so they're afforded, even though they are a collective 3-member group, they're afforded a little bit of the same luxury as a mayor or a town manager would do in a municipality. And so those administrative functions are those day-to-day type things that don't require notice. The public probably doesn't care about as a whole, even though there's always that one member of the community that wants to know every single little thing. There are the things like approving claims under a current contract. We had that situation in Lake County. Told you I'd pick on you, Jamal. But that's not the awarding of new contracts. That's just approving claims within a contract that's already been signed and executed. And there can be all kinds of things, ordering supplies. If they designate someone as a signatory authority to do those kind of things, that's fine and good. But if it's a county where all 3 of them have to have a meeting of the minds to do those administrative things, it wouldn't make much sense. Operations would grind to a halt if they would have to give 48 hours notice for each and every little thing like that. So I encourage you to seek out that new legislation. It's in the open door law. It's under title or section 4 or 5. Now it's escaping me of the open door law, but it's going to say what's appropriate for an executive session and what, or administrative function meeting, and what isn't. Any questions about executive sessions or administrative function meetings? Cell phones and smartphones and everything else, just tell them to use discretion when having those things out. Number one, I just think it looks bad if all their faces are buried in a smartphone while they're trying to conduct public business. And number two, I mean, if they are communicating online, online, that could be potentially in violation of the law. Yeah. Is that better now? Oh, it just recorded. All right, I'll try to speak up a little bit. Yeah, Tremont.
Quick question on that subject. Group email. I've seen some opinions prior to you that said group emails were okay. I've seen, I think you may have had a discussion where you said, no, don't do the group emails because it can do exactly what you said, turn to a meeting.
Right.
So how do you handle that for things like distribution? Like, let's say you have a board of 7 people, and I, as the attorney, want to just get something to them that I think is relevant for their next meeting, and they have some questions about it, and it could be a question that everybody's going to have because I'm not going to send them obviously a legal citation. How do you do that when you can't do the executive session? There's no pending legal action that you can speak to the attorney. What's the best practice?
Right. I'm kind of a realist when it comes to that. I know that email is the way we communicate, and to disseminate information like that and even invite some kind of back and forth, I think is perfectly appropriate. Once a mechanism is being used, mechanism meaning some mode of communication, more in real time, if it's an immediate call and response over a group reply all type email, if the expectation is that everyone is going to weigh in simultaneously or even within a short period of time, then you're flirting with having a meeting. Even though you're not in the same place at the same time, if it's that real-time communication, if it's in some kind of, what's the one now? There's something, is it WhatsApp or something like that? Is like an application on your phone that you can use to kind of have a group message, and it just kind of automatically disappears. But you can do group messaging. That kind of thing is really dangerous, I think. Email doesn't lend itself so much to being a potential danger, but certainly group text messaging, in any kind of instant message method, there's some software applications with group chats and things like that. Those are what I would steer clear of. Emails, though, I think they're fine. Especially in the context of what you describe. I think that's perfectly appropriate, and it doesn't, again, violate any kind of transparency issue, because those emails then become public record, which we'll talk about next. And emails being a large part of the electronic records held by any kind of government organization. That it's just the way we communicate now. There's no way around it. The legislature hasn't carved out any kind of exception for email communication particularly, so it becomes public record. As you can read up here, it's regardless of in any form or characteristic, it's a catch-all. It's pretty much anything you can think of. I have the picture of toilet paper down there. I always use the illustration that when I was an attorney at the Department of Health and we were promulgating a rule, opponents of that rule submitted their comment on rolls of toilet paper. And so those became public record, archived at the State Department of Health, and are still there because it's within the retention period. So it doesn't matter whether it's digitized, whether it's written down on with ink or lead on a piece of paper or a Post-it note or a napkin. If it meets the definition of a public record, if it's about substantive public business, then it becomes a public record. And email is certainly a part of that. In terms of email, one of the things that has been kind of fun for me as a policymaker is addressing the issue of how to go about making a request for emails that meets a standard of practicality. So whether that's what the law calls it reasonable particularity. I think inherent in that term, inherent in any kind of reasonable standard is going to be a practicality or a common sense element. And so for me, it always kind of, rankled me a bit when a constituent would make a request to a public agency and say, oh, I want all of Mayor Jones's emails. Well, that's not reasonably particular, and it's certainly not practical, especially if Mayor Jones is prolific on his email account, So over time, and with the assistance of a kind of a seminal court case in 2012, I've been able to hone down what a reasonably particular or a reasonably practical email request looks like, and it's pretty simple. You have to have an identified sender, an identified recipient, a time frame, and I generally suggest 6 months or less, and a subject matter or a set of keyword searches. And really, that's been my hard and fast rule. The courts have adopted a portion of that, and then I've kind of piggybacked off the rest in terms of the subject matter stuff. But I think it's important not only for the public official not to have to go on a wild goose chase to find those emails, but also so that if Mayor Jones did dump all 10,000 of his emails on the requester, well, that's not really being responsive either, because the requester then has to sort through and categorize all that, and they don't necessarily want to do that. They truly want something about a particularized subject matter. They just have to say it. They have to identify what that subject matter is. Now, we're not going to go today into the particulars of what's disclosable and what's not disclosable. That would take a significant more amount of time. Just know that those emails, especially if they're to an attorney, they may never see the light of day. They may be privileged communication. They may be deliberative material, which is a pretty big topic in and of itself. But there are exceptions to disclosure, But even more so, that's important for the requester to narrow down what they're looking for, so that you can scrutinize that request, you can scrutinize those materials, decide what's disclosable, what's inappropriate for disclosure, and everybody can go on their way, and the request is fulfilled appropriately. So that's what a reasonably particular email request would look like. And that reasonable particular language doesn't just apply to email, it applies to any kind of record at all. Part of the new legislation also addressed electronic records, and this isn't related, it's a little bit tangential, but basically what it says is that if a requester wants an electronic record, then it is to be provided to them in the form in which it was created. So if it's an Excel spreadsheet that they're looking for, you can't then convert it to a PDF and give it to them. It has to be provided in Excel form. And it can't be password protected so that they can't sort and analyze the data. This was an initiative by the media because, the reporter, they want to do some kind of data analysis. Now, the danger, and I think why public officials push back a little bit on that, is that what's to prevent the recipient of that data from manipulating, changing, altering, amending that data for their own purposes? Well, that's the case with any kind of record. That's kind of the risk you take when putting something out there. And if an unscrupulous public records requester does that, then that's on them. If they're fraudulently altering a public record, and presenting it as, the original, then they risk liability on that end. But you have the record originally to compare. And so that's your safeguard, that you have that original Excel spreadsheet showing that data in its original form. And if it's manipulated later on, that's your defense to say, wait a minute, that the story you're telling doesn't match up with the story that our data tells. But that new legislation does require, a public agency to provide the electronic record in the form in which it was created. Sometimes that's impossible. Sometimes there's I'll use court records as an example. A lot of courts use a special filing system for their court recordings. So their audio recordings, which are, subject of a lot of requests, they don't use a WAV file or an MP3 file. It's a special proprietary file specific to their recording system. So basically what they do is download that on a CD and convert it to a format where a consumer can use it, and it doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of effort. There's no expense to it, but that's appropriate in that case. Because the public doesn't have the ability to translate that material. Same thing if you use a proprietary database or something like that, and there's no other way to provide it, then we can talk about providing that in another form, converting it somehow so that it's either accessible or disclosable. Maybe you need to lock something in order to redact certain fields, and your IT department would know much more about their capabilities to do this than I do, but there are certain situations where electronic records need to be redacted, and there are ways of doing that by altering and manipulating that data. Those things are still okay, but I think the statute indicates a good faith effort to provide it in the form in which it was created, if possible. Which kind of leads me to another kind of controversial topic, which is the matter of private email use by public officials using their private emails for public business. When I started my tenure, one of my very first opinions was to kind of come out and say that a documented message regarding public business in any, again, regardless of form or characteristics, it is going to be a public record and should be treated as such. I got a lot of pushback from that, from places you wouldn't normally expect. And they all said that they were hanging on this language here that says, material that is created, received, retained, maintained, or filed by or with a public agency. To say, wait a minute, okay, if I use my Gmail or Yahoo account, even if I'm using it to communicate with my colleagues about public business, well, that doesn't land on a public server. So, it's not a public record. I could do anything I want on my Gmail account. I can completely abandon my public account and never use it at all because it's easier and more convenient for me to use my Gmail account. That was kind of the mindset. Not factoring into the fact that a public employee or a public official, when performing public business, is acting as an agent of the public agency itself. If and only if they're acting in their official capacity as an employee or as an official. I use my Gmail account for public business. I do. And I have sometimes the state servers are down on weekends and I got to send a note to somebody and it's just convenient for me to do it. I have an easy way of fixing the problem is that I just CC my public account. It winds up there anyway, no harm done. It's all filed and retained by our IT department. But sometimes even on the local level, maybe a public official doesn't have access to a public server. Small town boards or a school corporation doesn't have emails for their board members. That's pretty common. The answer to that, the solution to that is to either, number one, create one of those private accounts that is exclusively used for public business and nothing else, or just have a email in your everyday, or a folder in your everyday email account that's labeled school business, or county business or whatever, and just dump everything into that folder. Problem solved. Now, what I'm talking about doesn't expose the entire account to public scrutiny. So that doesn't mean that someone can come in and look at my messages to my wife or my family or my fantasy football league only those messages that pertain to public business would be public record. And there are other areas in the law that that do speak to that agency type consideration. An employee creating a record on behalf of an agency. There's a Title V provision that deals with the state archives that speaks to that. So just by using that language to say, oh, it doesn't wind up on a public agency server, it falls flat in light of those other and just, again, good governance type policy considerations. Yeah. Now say that one more time. That's a good question. So whose job is it to determine what's public and what's private? That whole account is going to be in the custody of that employee or that official. So a little bit they're on the honor system, quite frankly. And so it's up to them to use that discretion appropriately to decide what's public, what's private, what's disclosable, what's not disclosable. Maybe that involves a discussion with an attorney about that or with a colleague. But ultimately, my point and why I send that message is to say that be a custodian of it as if it were a traditional public record on a public server, not to chill the use of it, but merely to say, okay, if you're going to use that mechanism, which is fine, use it responsibly. Any questions about that? Okay, great. All right. So, a couple more things here. I don't want to go over my time. We've got about 15 minutes left. Two things I want to close on: economic development and social media. Let's do economic development first. Now I know that the name of the game these days is if you're going to be in politics, then you're going to have a strong foothold in the economic development game. You want to tout jobs coming in. You want to tout tax revenue coming in. You want to, set up TIF districts and incentives to bring in business, and that's all fine and good. This is not a commentary on any of that whatsoever. What scares me a little bit these days is that there are all kinds of creative ways for an economic development organization, locally, a LEDO, to skirt not only audit considerations, but also public records considerations by setting up their organizations in a creative way. I'll give you some examples. And I want to talk about a court case as well. The rule of thumb is for a non-government agency, if they receive public funds, an appropriation, a grant, doesn't really matter where it comes from, doesn't matter whether it comes from the city or the county or an aggregate of any source of public money. The word is public money is what the statute uses. If that organization receives $200,000 or more, and that makes up 50% or more of their budget, then they're subject to audit by the State Board of Accounts, and in turn, they're subject to the public access laws. So if, to use the fictional Marion County Economic Development Corporation, the Marion County Economic Development Corporation receives from the city of Indianapolis $199,999. They are not subject to audit. Even if that is 100% of their budget, it doesn't meet that threshold. If they receive $201,000, they meet the first prong of that test. But it also means that their budget has to be $402,000 or less, making up 50% of their budget or more, anywhere in between. So if they meet both of those prongs, then they're subject to audit, subject to public access. So what you'll find statewide, especially in rural counties, are LEDOs that receive $198,000, $199,000, just stopping short of that $200,000 figure. And in some of the larger counties, they'll receive $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, but their budgets will be, $1.5 million, $2 million, and the State Board of Accounts won't audit them. I won't make a fuss because they don't meet that threshold. That's a statutory threshold in the State Board of Accounts title. Can't remember it off the top of my head. It's in Title V. But anyway, that's the two-pronged test. What a lot of LEDOs will do, however, some of the more unscrupulous, I don't know if that's the right word or not, they'll have an economic development organization with a certain board of directors and a certain executive director. And then they'll have an economic development foundation with a same board of directors, the same executive director, but maybe they'll file, with a little bit of a different name, John Smith, executive director, J. Smith, executive director. These are real examples. I've seen this. Then they'll have a third, the economic development, and use some other type of bureaucratic business organization word. This one will receive $199,000. This one will receive $199,000. This one will receive $199,000. It's all controlled by the same group. They are maybe taking it from the city of Indianapolis. This one from Marion County. This one from Beech Grove. The next one from Southport. All public money, all taxpayer money that I earned, that you earned, that's coming out of our pocket, that we turn over in April. Someone has earned that money, and it's being spent by these economic development organizations on what? Maybe it's a completely benevolent exercise. Maybe they're all bringing in jobs and tax revenues and all kinds of money. It could be a great thing. Or it could be ripe for abuse as well. But my point is that those kind of clever, schemes, the State Board of Accounts has kind of drawn a line in the sand and saying, no, we're gonna scrutinize those the same way as if in the aggregate they're making in excess of $200,000 and it's more than 50% of their budget. So I think the State Board of Accounts has said, they're not going to play those kind of games. They're not going to allow those kind of shell companies to do that kind of thing. They're taking a harder look at economic development activities, and again, rightfully so, because that's a lot of money going out the door with little or no strings attached. Because a lot of times these, a local municipality or a county won't have the time or means or even know-how to audit that money. They see economic development as a good thing, so they write it into an appropriation, but that money kind of goes into a black hole. And again, good or bad, but the public gets the right to know, to an extent, how that money is being used if it reaches that level of public funding. All that makes sense? Okay. The argument against that is a case out of Perry County back in 1999. I can't remember the entire citation, but it was out of Perry County. Basically what that case dealt with was a local economic development organization that only received $30,000 in public funding. Doesn't meet that statutory threshold, isn't subject to audit, isn't subject to the open records law. Someone sued to say they were acting as a state actor, so they used kind of a functional equivalency analysis to apply to economic development. That's not the case. Economic development isn't a core state function, so even if an organization is engaging in those kind of activities, not a state function, doesn't meet the functional equivalency analysis, and that case said, No. But what it did say is kind of echoing that statute that says if the entity would not exist but for the public money. If their budget is exclusively operating on public money, they are kind of acting as the spending arm of a municipality, but only if it hits that $200,000 threshold. Anything below that, even if their budget is entirely public money, statutorily that's okay. But that Perry County case does not override that statute, and that's been the argument that the Perry County case, because they didn't address the statute specifically, they didn't have to. It was only $30,000. So that's been a recent chain of analysis that I've had to do with some smaller economic development corporations, but they're getting more and more clever as to how they do business, and I think that can be a dangerous road to go down, no matter how worthy the cause. Last thing I want to talk about today, if there's no other questions about economic development, with the time we have left, is social media and what that means for counties, what that means for municipalities, what that means for Luke Britt, Public Access Counselor. Again, regardless of form or characteristic, if it's public business documented somehow, then it's going to be a public record. And a Twitter feed or a Facebook post or an Instagram account is no different. And there's going to be an evolution of guidance on this because it is new. Like I mentioned at the beginning, 5 years ago, it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. So the rule of thumb is if you if a public official or a public employee is holding themselves out as a public official or a representative of a public agency, or the public agency is the account itself, then all the activity associated with that account is going to be public record. So if it's Twitter, it's likes, it's posts, it's retweets. There are some questions as to whether responses to those tweets in that feed are public record. I'd have to look at that on a case-by-case basis, but maybe. What if an abusive comment comes in using profanity on that feed, whether it be on a Facebook post, forum, or Twitter feed, or whatever, a comment somewhere on a post? Then what happens? Can the agency hide that comment for good taste purposes or for any other purposes? Generally, yeah, that can be hidden. I encourage all agencies using a social media account to have some kind of front-facing policy that says what kind of content is appropriate and what isn't. And again, do that by not the message, but by the language used, whether it's profane or obscene, not necessarily whether it's in support or opposition to an initiative or an agency. So that's going to evolve. It's going to change. The highest profile case around here came out of Beech Grove, which was recently settled, where the agency was deleting Facebook comments they didn't like. The ACLU came in and said that's chilling freedom of speech because you've afforded the public the opportunity to comment on that forum. And so you provided that platform, and you can't discriminate based on political speech or the message itself. Never went to the Court of Appeals, so we don't have any kind of precedent on that. But, I mean, it does at least lend itself to a cause of action if a public agency is indiscriminately or discriminatorily deleting or amending posts. So I just wanted to throw that out there more as a rhetorical thing than anything else, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Yeah. So in the For the purposes of archiving, I do. If it's large, if the agency is large enough to justify that kind of expenditure, absolutely. The state just entered into a contract with a social archiving firm from North Carolina, who I've had some contact with, and they seem very reputable. But there are lots of other firms out there that do the same sort of thing, and it makes it easier for your IT department. If you outsource that kind of task, they don't have to do it. It's just cleaner that way if you have a lot of social media activity. If there's not a lot, if it's just a single agency page and it's manageable, then that's probably overkill to do that. But those kinds of vendors are available, and competition in that field is growing pretty steadily. So, all right, guys, that's all I have for today. Open invitation to contact me at any time. Try to make myself as accessible and approachable as possible. But I really hope you took something away from this. And let me know if you have any other questions. Be glad to fill you in on anything offline. Thank you.